I decided to rent a cabin in the woods for a weekend, hoping to escape the noise of everyday life. The cabin was small and isolated, surrounded by tall trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. It felt perfect for some peace and quiet. I arrived in the late afternoon, unpacked my things, and settled in. The cabin had everything I needed: a small kitchen, a cozy bed, and a wood-burning stove. I felt excited to spend time alone in nature. As night fell, the woods around the cabin grew dark and silent. I made a fire and curled up with a book, but soon the sounds of the forest began to change. The wind rustled the leaves, and I heard the occasional snap of a twig. It was unsettling, but I tried to push it out of my mind. I went to bed early, thinking I'd be able to sleep off the odd feeling. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a loud crash outside. My heart raced as I lay still in bed, straining to listen. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. I wanted to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly got out of bed. The cabin creaked as I moved, adding to the tense atmosphere. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. The moonlight cast eerie shadows among the trees. I aimed my flashlight towards the sound and saw that a large branch had fallen from a nearby tree, blocking part of the path leading away from the cabin. Relief washed over me, but then I noticed something strange: footprints in the soft ground, leading away from the cabin. The prints looked like they belonged to a man, large and heavy. My stomach twisted as I realized they weren't mine. Panic set in as I turned to head back inside. I wanted to lock the door and hide, but I stopped short when I heard a rustling noise coming from the trees. It sounded too deliberate to be an animal. I ran back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. My mind raced as I tried to calm down. What if someone was out there? I grabbed my phone, but there was no service. I felt trapped and exposed, a sense of dread filling the cabin. I sat on the floor with my back against the door, holding my flashlight tightly. Hours passed, and every sound outside made me jump. Just when I thought it was safe, I heard a soft knock at the window. It was faint, but it sent a chill down my spine. I didn't move, terrified to even breathe. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. I waited, hoping whoever or whatever was out there would leave. Eventually, I dared to peek out the window. The moonlight illuminated the area, but I saw no one. The footprints were still visible in the dirt, leading deeper into the woods. As dawn broke, I felt a mix of fear and relief. I packed my things quickly, glancing out the window every few seconds. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. The sun began to rise, and with it, a sense of safety returned. I climbed into my car, eager to get away from the cabin and the fear that lingered there. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The cabin slowly disappeared from view, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I promised myself I would never return to the woods alone. Some places, no matter how peaceful they seem, can hide dangers that lurk just out of sight. Last fall, I rented a remote cabin near a lake for a weekend escape. I'd been needing a break from the chaos of city life and thought the quiet woods would help me unwind. It was isolated, nestled among tall trees, with no neighbors or other cabins in sight. I stocked up on food and firewood and settled in, planning to spend my time reading and hiking by the lake. There was no cell service, and that was part of the appeal. A weekend with nothing to do but relax. The first day was peaceful, the weather perfect. I took a hike along the lake in the afternoon, admiring how calm and still everything felt. By nightfall, I was back at the cabin, tired but happy. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves or the wind moving through the trees. I ate, lit a fire in the wood stove, and eventually drifted off to sleep, feeling content. Around midnight, a strange noise woke me. It was faint, but it sounded like someone tapping or knocking, like a branch hitting the side of the cabin. I tried to brush it off as just the wind, but the tapping continued, slow and irregular. After a while, it stopped, and I managed to fall asleep again, thinking nothing of it. The next night, the tapping came back. This time, it sounded more deliberate, as if someone was walking around the cabin, testing each wall. I was wide awake, every small sound suddenly louder in the silent cabin. I lay in bed, telling myself it was just an animal, but the longer it went on, the harder it was to ignore. Eventually, it stopped, and I somehow convinced myself it was just the sounds of the forest playing tricks on me. When I woke up on the third morning, I decided to go outside and check the area around the cabin. As I walked around, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine, and they were too large to belong to any animal I could think of. They circled the cabin, close to the walls, and then trailed off into the woods. The sight of them left a chill down my spine, but I pushed it aside. Maybe they were old. Maybe someone had been hunting nearby and gotten close to the cabin by mistake. That night, I went to bed early, hoping to leave first thing in the morning. But the tapping started again, this time more persistent, moving from wall to wall like someone was looking for a way inside. I could hear soft footsteps outside, stopping and starting, pacing back and forth. I stayed frozen in bed, every nerve on edge, until finally, the sounds faded away just before dawn. At first light, I packed up and left without even eating breakfast. As I walked to my car, I looked back at the cabin and felt relieved to be putting it behind me. But when I reached my car, I saw something I hadn't noticed the day I arrived. Scratches on the driver's side door. They weren't deep, but they looked like they'd been made recently, with jagged lines stretching across the metal. I hadn't parked near any branches, and there was nothing nearby that could have caused it. Those marks looked intentional. I drove back to the city, feeling tense the whole way. Even now, the memory of those quiet footsteps and the scratches on my car door haunts me. I never found out who or what was out there, but I'm not eager to return to a cabin in the woods anytime soon. One fall, I decided to spend a weekend alone in a remote cabin to get away from the city. I'd been feeling overwhelmed and thought some quiet time in the woods would clear my head. The cabin was basic, just one room with a small kitchen, bed, and a fireplace. There was no cell reception, which I welcomed, thinking it would help me disconnect for a few days. The first day passed quietly. I explored the area around the cabin, watching the leaves change colors and listening to the birds. The solitude felt peaceful, but by nightfall, the silence settled heavily. Without the usual city sounds, every creak in the cabin and every rustle outside seemed amplified. I told myself it was just the wind and the woods adjusting to the night. But the second night, things took a strange turn. Late into the night, I woke up to a faint noise, like something scraping against wood. I lay still, trying to figure out if it was the wind or an animal. The noise was soft but steady, like someone was slowly running something sharp against the outside wall. I stayed quiet, hoping it would stop, but it continued, moving along the wall as if something, or someone, was circling the cabin. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably just a branch or an animal brushing against the wall. But the noise didn't sound random. It was slow and purposeful, and it circled the cabin several times. I pulled the blanket over me, hoping the sound would eventually stop. Finally, after what felt like hours, the noise faded, and I was able to fall back asleep. When morning came, I stepped outside to look for anything that might explain the noise. The ground was covered in a layer of fallen leaves, but near the cabin, I noticed something strange. There were clear drag marks, like someone had pulled something heavy around the cabin. My stomach dropped when I saw faint footprints in the soft ground next to the marks. They were larger than mine and spaced widely, as if whoever or whatever made them had been walking slowly and deliberately. I followed the prints and drag marks around the cabin. They circled the entire perimeter, then led off into the woods and disappeared. The sight of those prints, knowing I'd heard them in the dark, sent a chill through me. It made me realize that whatever had been outside wasn't a random animal. It was someone, and they had been close. I didn't waste any time after that. I packed up my things as quickly as possible and started down the trail, looking back over my shoulder every few steps. I kept thinking about how I'd been lying in that cabin, just a thin wall away from whoever had been outside, and how easily they could have come inside if they'd wanted to. I was exhausted by the time I made it back to my car, but the relief I felt as I locked myself inside was like nothing I'd ever known. I drove away, never looking back, and I never felt the urge to go back to the woods again. I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend away in the woods. After weeks of work stress, the idea of being alone in a small cabin, surrounded by nothing but trees, felt perfect. The cabin was old but sturdy, with a small wood stove, a single bed, and large windows looking out onto the forest. No phone signal, no Wi-Fi, exactly what I needed. The first night went by peacefully. I sat by the fire, read a book, and let myself fall into a deep, heavy sleep. By morning, I felt rested, enjoying the quiet and the fresh forest air. But that evening, just after sundown, something strange happened. I was sitting inside with the only sound being the crackling fire. It was that deep kind of silence you only find in the woods. Suddenly, I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, crunching over the fallen leaves. I froze, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe it was an animal? But no, the steps were too heavy, too rhythmic. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But then I heard them again, moving around the cabin, as if someone was circling it. My heart began to pound as I waited, barely daring to breathe. The steps would pause, then start up again, each time sounding closer to the cabin walls. I didn't want to overreact, but I wasn't stupid. I grabbed the small pocket knife I had packed and stood by the door, ready to defend myself if necessary. The steps stopped, and for a while, everything was quiet. I was almost convinced that maybe it had been an animal after all. But then, I noticed something. The door handle was moving, slowly, as if someone was testing it. My blood went cold. I kept completely still, knife clutched tightly in my hand. After a few tense seconds, the handle stopped moving, and I heard the footsteps retreating. I waited, heart pounding, for what felt like an eternity, until finally, I couldn't hear anything. I barely slept that night, jumping at every tiny noise. At dawn, I quickly packed my things and left. As I got into my car, I noticed something on the cabin door. 3 deep scratches carved into the wood near the handle. They were fresh, like someone had dragged a knife or a blade down the door. Driving away, I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just some stranger trying to scare me. But something in me knew it was more than that, and I realized I wouldn't be coming back to the cabin anytime soon. The silence I had once looked forward to now felt too empty, too unsettling, and I couldn't forget the sound of those steps in the night. I decided to take a weekend away from the city and rented a small cabin deep in the woods. I'd been feeling burnt out from work and just needed to clear my head. The cabin was isolated, but that was part of the appeal. No distractions, no people, just me and the silence of nature. It was a small place just big enough for one person. There was no Wi-Fi and cell service was patchy, which only added to the sense of being off the grid. The first night was quiet. I settled in, read a book by candlelight, and listened to the occasional sounds of wildlife outside. Around midnight, I heard some scratching noises coming from behind the cabin. I brushed it off as an animal and didn't think much of it. But the scratching didn't stop. It would go silent for a few minutes, then pick up again, now on a different wall. I figured a raccoon or something was trying to get in, so I just pulled my blanket tighter and tried to ignore it. The next morning, I walked around outside, looking for signs of an animal. I found faint claw marks along the wood of the cabin, but nothing that alarmed me. I thought it might be a stray dog or some other small animal, and I went about my day. The hours passed peacefully, and by dusk, I was feeling more relaxed than I had in weeks. That night, though, things felt different. As I was getting ready for bed, I realized just how quiet it was outside. Too quiet. Even the usual sounds of birds and insects had stopped. Then, around midnight again, the scratching started, this time louder and more aggressive. I sat up in bed, trying to convince myself it was the same animal from before, but the noise was getting closer, like it was moving along the outside walls. I started to feel uneasy. It was an unshakable feeling that something was wrong. The scratching grew louder, and then I heard a low thud, as if something heavy was being dragged across the ground outside. My heart pounded as I thought about all the possibilities, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I sat there listening until the sound stopped altogether. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, clutching my flashlight, too scared to even breathe loudly. In the morning, I packed up and decided to leave early. As I stepped outside, I noticed something odd. A series of deep, uneven footprints leading from the edge of the woods to the cabin and then back again. They weren't from any animal I knew of, and they looked almost human but distorted, like whoever or whatever had made them was injured or dragging something. They led off into the trees, vanishing into the dense brush. I didn't stick around to investigate. I got in my car and drove back to the city, my nerves on edge the entire way. Weeks passed, and I tried to push the memory of that night out of my mind, but I never really could. I never found out who or what it was that circled the cabin. But every now and then, late at night, I still hear that scratching in my dreams. One weekend, I decided to escape the city's constant noise and pressure by renting a cabin deep in the woods. It seemed perfect, quiet, isolated, with no one around for miles. The cabin itself was old but well kept, with a large front porch and creaky wooden floors. It felt just right for the kind of break I was looking for. After unloading my things, I took a walk through the nearby woods, letting the sounds of nature relax me. The silence was so deep it was almost loud, broken only by the occasional rustle of branches or the sudden flap of a bird's wings. As the afternoon faded into evening, I headed back to the cabin, ready to settle in for the night. The first few hours were peaceful. I read a book, cooked a simple meal, and finally stretched out on the couch, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. But as night took hold, the atmosphere began to change. I noticed little noises at first, an occasional creak on the porch, a soft thud against the walls. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just the old structure settling. Around midnight, I was startled by a louder sound, a distinct crunching of footsteps just outside the cabin. It was slow, deliberate, like someone taking careful steps. My heart started to pound. I thought about getting up to check, but my mind kept coming up with rational explanations. Maybe a deer had wandered close, or maybe the sound was just the wood shifting in the cold night air. But then came a sharp knock on the front door. There was no mistaking it this time. Someone was outside. I didn't move, barely even breathed, hoping they'd go away. Seconds passed, feeling like hours, and the knocking stopped. But just as I started to relax, it started again, louder and more insistent this time. I felt trapped. My car was parked just a few yards away, but there was no way I was about to open the door and risk seeing who or what was out there. I decided to stay as quiet as possible, hoping that whoever it was would eventually give up and leave. The knocking turned into banging, and the sound was frantic, desperate, like someone trying to break in. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I felt completely cut off, left to face this unknown threat alone. The banging continued, echoing through the small cabin, and then silence. Minutes passed, stretching into an hour, then 2. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, wide-eyed, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, dawn broke, casting light through the thin curtains. I gathered my things, not even bothering to repack, and made a run for my car. As I drove away, I looked back at the cabin. It stood there, still and quiet, as if nothing had happened. I left that place behind without looking back, but the memory of that night stayed with me, a reminder of just how vulnerable isolation can make you. I never found out who or what was at the door that night. Maybe it was just someone lost, looking for help. But the fear I felt was real, and it's the last time I'll ever stay alone in a place like that. I had decided to spend a quiet weekend alone in an old cabin up in the mountains, hoping to escape the stress of work and the constant hum of city life. The place was isolated, surrounded by thick trees, and had a small lake nearby. It seemed perfect when I booked it online. No neighbors, no traffic, just silence and nature. I packed some essentials, brought extra blankets and firewood, and figured I'd have a peaceful couple of days. The first night was colder than I'd expected, and the cabin creaked in the wind. I kept hearing faint rustling noises, but I told myself it was just animals outside. I tried to sleep but couldn't shake an uneasy feeling, like I was being watched. I brushed it off, put it down to city nerves, and finally drifted off. The next day, I took a short hike around the cabin, staying close by so I wouldn't get lost. I noticed strange things that seemed out of place. A fresh cigarette but near the edge of the lake, some footprints in the mud that didn't look like mine, and a worn, old jacket hanging on a tree branch. I hadn't seen anyone else out here, so it felt strange, but I convinced myself these were just leftovers from whoever had rented the cabin before me. That night, though, things got stranger. As I was about to go to bed, I heard what sounded like footsteps outside. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear through the thin walls. The footsteps stopped, but then something tapped against one of the windows, like a branch, only there weren't any trees that close. I told myself it was probably just an animal drawn by the light inside. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of the cabin door creaking open. My heart pounded as I lay still, every muscle tense. The door was locked. I checked it twice before bed. I held my breath, trying to listen, and I heard faint shuffling sounds near the doorway. Whoever or whatever was out there was trying to be quiet. I stayed motionless, too afraid to even get out of bed. After what felt like an hour, the sounds finally stopped, and I heard the door shut softly. I stayed awake the rest of the night, eyes fixed on the door, barely breathing. When dawn broke, I forced myself to check the cabin. Nothing was missing, but the door was slightly ajar, despite the lock still being in place. I didn't waste a second. I packed up my things and left, my heart still racing. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone lurking behind the trees or watching from a distance. I never saw anyone, but I knew something or someone had been there with me. I still don't know if it was a prank or if someone had been hiding out there watching, but I never went back to that cabin. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that I was being watched and that leaving when I did was the only reason I made it out safely. I thought a weekend alone in a secluded cabin would be the perfect break. I'd found a place online, buried deep in the woods, far away from the noise of the city. It looked cozy in the photos, and something about being away from my phone and laptop sounded like the reset I needed. I arrived in the late afternoon, dropped my bags inside, and took a quick look around. It was exactly what I wanted. Just a small, rustic cabin with a simple bed, a fireplace, and big windows that showed nothing but trees. As night fell, the silence around me felt almost too deep. I'd never been in a place so quiet. There were no distant cars, no planes overhead, just the occasional creak from the old cabin or rustle of leaves outside. I tried to read, but my mind kept wandering, caught on every little sound. Finally, I decided to go to bed early, figuring I'd be more comfortable with a fresh start in the morning. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, startled by a sound that was sharper than the others. A faint scraping noise just outside. My heart started pounding, and I lay there, frozen, listening. It sounded close, maybe just by the door. My mind raced through all the things it could be. An animal, a branch scratching against the wood, but something about it felt off. I got up quietly and peeked through the window, my breath fogging up the glass. In the dim moonlight, I could see fresh footprints in the dirt outside, leading right up to the door. I hadn't brought much to defend myself, but I found a heavy flashlight and clutched it tightly, listening. The sound stopped, and for a moment, I thought maybe it was my imagination or an animal passing by. But just as I started to calm down, I heard footsteps moving away, slowly crunching on the forest floor. Whoever, or whatever, had been right outside my door was now heading deeper into the woods. In the morning, I went outside to inspect. The footprints were still there, clear as day, too large for an animal and unmistakably human. I looked around but saw nothing out of place, just the tracks leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the trees. I packed my things right after that. Whatever it was, whoever it was, I wasn't about to stick around and find out. By the time I reached my car, I felt a wave of relief, like I just walked away from something that could have gone very wrong. As I drove away, I kept glancing back at the cabin in the rearview mirror, feeling the weight of a close call with something I didn't fully understand, but that left a chill that lingered long after I was safely home. I never considered myself someone who'd fear silence, but after that night at the cabin, silence gained a new edge. I had rented a small cabin in the woods for a weekend away from the city, thinking the quiet would clear my mind. I'd been stressed out from work and figured some isolation would help me breathe a little easier. The cabin was simple: one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a wood stove that I struggled to light. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves outside and the creaks of the old wooden floors. The first night was uneventful. I woke up to sunlight and the distant sound of birds. I spent the day reading, walking in the woods, and cooking up a quick meal. The forest was thick, with trails that seemed to twist and lead nowhere, so I stuck close to the cabin, not wanting to get lost. By sunset, a deep stillness fell, one that felt heavier than during the day. The air was so silent it was like the world had stopped moving, and there was something unsettling about it. But I shook it off, reminding myself this was what I'd come for: peace and quiet. Then, around midnight, I heard it, a soft, repetitive thump coming from outside. I sat up in bed, my ears straining to catch any sound. The noise stopped, and for a few minutes, there was nothing, only silence. I lay back down, trying to convince myself it was just a branch or some animal. But just as I started to relax, the sound came again, this time louder, closer. It was coming from just outside the cabin door. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding. I wasn't about to open that door in the middle of the night. I told myself it was probably just an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After a long stretch of silence, I finally managed to drift off, only to be woken up again by a scraping sound near the windows. The noise was slow, deliberate, like someone or something was dragging something sharp across the glass. At that point, I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin. It didn't matter what was outside. I just wanted to get out of there. I packed up my things as quietly as I could, keeping the lights off. I grabbed my car keys and, after a tense minute waiting for any other sounds, opened the door. The night was pitch black, but I didn't waste time. I bolted for my car, locked the doors, and drove down the rough road without looking back. It wasn't until I reached the town about 20 miles away that I finally let myself breathe. I checked my phone for any messages or missed calls, and it hit me that I hadn't had any signal at the cabin. I hadn't even thought about it until then. I stopped at a small diner to gather myself, and as I drank a coffee, I overheard some locals talking about a recent break-in near the cabin area. Apparently, someone had been breaking into remote cabins and stealing supplies, sometimes even waiting for the renters to leave for groceries before slipping in. That night, I couldn't shake the thought that someone might have been watching me in that cabin, maybe even planning to come inside. It was a relief to realize I hadn't been imagining things, but it left a hollow feeling in my gut. As I drove back to the city, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I might have come to finding out what was behind those noises. I was safe, but I'd never really feel alone in the same way again. One winter, I decided to rent a small cabin in the woods, far from any city noise. I'd been feeling burnt out and thought some time alone might help. The cabin was just a one-room setup, basic but enough for a few nights. There was no cell service, no internet, just me and the sounds of the forest. I felt that familiar mix of excitement and unease as I unpacked. I was eager to be alone with my thoughts, yet the silence was so thick it seemed almost oppressive. The first night passed without much happening. I stayed inside, reading and jotting down notes, trying to reflect and unwind. The wind howled outside, branches tapping against the window, but that was it. The quiet made it hard to sleep, but by morning, I had gotten a bit more used to it. The second night, however, was different. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside, crunching through the snow. They weren't the casual steps of someone passing by, and I knew no one else should be out here. I stayed very still, hoping it was just an animal, though deep down I knew it didn't sound like one. The steps circled around the cabin, pausing occasionally. My heart was pounding, and I could feel every thud in my chest. I tried to tell myself that maybe it was just a hiker who got lost, someone who'd made their way up here accidentally. But as I listened to the careful, deliberate sound of those steps, something felt off. There was no random wandering. These steps felt like they had a purpose. When they stopped directly outside my door, I held my breath. I was in total darkness, too afraid to turn on the lights and reveal I was inside. I stayed motionless, straining to hear any sign of them leaving. Minutes passed, then more, but I heard nothing. Just as I was starting to think they'd gone, I heard a faint scratching at the door, like someone was running their fingers along the wood. It was slow, almost testing, feeling for any sign of weakness. Panic surged in me, and I started running through options in my head, but none of them seemed like they'd actually help. After what felt like hours, the scratching stopped. I waited, tense, barely breathing. Eventually, I dared to glance out the window, but there was no one there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't gone far. I spent the rest of the night sitting in a corner, holding my flashlight like it could protect me somehow. By dawn, I didn't waste a second packing up. I left the cabin exactly as I'd found it and started down the snowy path back to my car. When I reached the spot where I'd parked, I saw something that made me stop. Right there in the snow, next to my tire tracks, were a set of footprints leading off into the woods. They were fresh and they weren't mine. Whoever had been out there had come close to my car at some point during the night. I got in, locked the doors, and didn't look back. Whatever peace I'd hoped to find out there wasn't worth the dread that had set into my bones.